And I'd just like to introduce you to Paul MacDonald here.
Hello, hello. How are you doing?
Okay. All right.
So we are in an undisclosed location somewhere south of Edinburgh.
Somewhere in the Scottish borders.
Somewhere in the Scottish borders. The Scottish borders, yeah.
So first of all, Paul, I've known you from a way back when we met, when we were playing music in one of the local pubs in Edinburgh. And I know you were very interested in the bagpipes at that time and Scottish traditions and so on. I'd like to find out a bit more about you because what you do on today is swords. You're a sword maker and you're also a master at arms, and I'm not very sure what that is. So I'd like to educate myself, and our audience, I'm sure, are very interested here also. So first of all, if you'd just like to give us a wee bit of your history, your roots, and how you came to dealing in this amazing historic subject for us here. Okay, so over to you. Yeah.
Not a problem, not a problem. Well, originally I'm from Moidart in the West Highlands. That's the western side of Lochaber. And growing up with tales of history there, and of course the land and lore around you was a great thing. And I came to Edinburgh in 1992 for university originally. And it's while I was at university I really discovered my real passion, something I really wanted to follow for life, and that was the path of the sword. And there was two sides to that path simultaneously. I got involved in the martial side in learning about swordsmanship, starting with sport fencing first. That's all there was at the time, but I was really more interested in, you know, the original roots of swordsmanship. More than a sporting aspect. What if these blades are sharp and live, and how did they train historically? What techniques and methods did they use? So that really captured my attention.
Did you play? Did you fence for the university while you were there? Were you in the university
I did actually had to start the university club. There wasn't a club at Napier University at that time where it was, so I had to start that from scratch. I got involved in as much training as I could. I was training 5 days a week and 7 if there was a competition at the weekend when I was really, really into it. But I also realised what sport fencing wasn't after a while as well. There was something I was looking for that was lacking in that scene, and that was the martial reality of swordsmanship. So I tried to find it, I couldn't, and was forced with the idea that I had to start something, I had to start a group, and so did that in 1994. That was the Dawn Duelist Society, the first group I established, and I've since gone to establish my own Academy of Arms, MacDonald Academy of Arms in Edinburgh, training people in martial swordsmanship with the basket-hilted broadsword as a core weapon. But also at the same time in Edinburgh, I loved the steel. I think everybody likes shiny things, and I was particularly attracted to blades, a magnetic attraction if you like, and specifically in the crafting of arms. You know, the work that went into making a functional blade and hilt and all the components to do with that as well. So when I left university, I was offered full-time work actually in a place in Edinburgh called Castle Arms at the time, and it's no longer around. And I was making mild steel wall hangers for for tourist market largely. But it was from there I really picked up my tool use skills, use of hand tools and power tools and crafting steel and other materials. And I was always looking for that element of reality, I suppose, in the use of the arms and in the crafting of them. And so again, I was faced with the choice that, that I could start something, I could start my own business focusing on that, which I did. In March 1998, the doors opened for MacDonald Armouries, which is here in the Scottish borders now today. Only just recently moved from Edinburgh, where I was there for over 20 years, so relocated business here now.
Yeah, excuse me. Joe and I, as guides, we talk about lots of things, but I find a lot of the time I certainly don't talk an awful lot about Scottish weaponry, unless we're maybe talking about historical dramas on television and stuff like that, but I might also mention it in terms of the royalty, the monarchs of Scotland. But I'm just wondering how normal in Edinburgh, historic Edinburgh, would it have been to come across guys like you making weapons? Or was it just for a very small group, and how the ordinary people How did they protect themselves? Maybe just a little bit of that sort of background.
Yes. Well, you had throughout Europe, you had arms production centres, and one of the main centres for the whole of Europe, for Western Europe, was Germany. And Solingen and Passau were the main blade production centres, and they exported to a lot of Europe as well, including the British Isles, including Scotland. A lot of Jacobite swords you'll find have blades that were made in Germany because they were really the best quality mass-produced blades at the time. But you did, of course, have smaller working armouries where they would make the blades as well as make the hilts and so on. And it was in the cities, in fact, that you found a lot of armourers. You would find the sword makers, the knife makers, and the gun makers as well, operating in the High Street and the Royal Mile. The Canongate in particular was known as the hub, really, in Edinburgh, as to where you would find your craftsmen historically.
Yeah, because was thinking, obviously, the more money you had, the wealthier you were, maybe the safer you were, because you could invest on weapons that were not maybe so available to the poorer people. Was there that sort of, obviously, social divide in terms of...
There was an inner respect, because it was expected that if you're being raised in a martial culture, which pretty much all of Scotland has been through most history, it was expected that you train in combat, you train in arms. In the Highlands, of course, that was quite common as a community form of training as well. And often in the Highlands, in fact, you would train under local fencing masters. Now, these would probably be grizzled old veterans themselves that saw terrible action at Killiecrankie or such, and had their own stories and backgrounds of combat. And you would learn how to use the sword, as well as wrestling, as well as knife use as well. These were all the traditional forms, and the use of the single stick, that's an ancient form as well, you would learn. And so you'd be expected, really, by the time you're in your early teenage years, to be quite capable in swordsmanship, martially quite proficient. And when you look at the age of the young lads who are called up for battle, all throughout the Jacobite risings through 17th and 18th century there, you're seeing lads of 14, 15, 16 years old fighting in the front line, but that's because they're already trained, they're already hardened lads that way. That was not unusual in the Highlands. So you'd be expected to train. You'd also be expected to invest in good quality arms, especially in the Highlands. That was part of the long-standing tradition that you might not own much in life. You'd have a croft, you'd have, your simple belongings and possessions, but if anything you owned was to be quality, it was to be your arms. And if these weren't arms that were passed down generationally, then it would be arms you'd be expected to invest in with your own money itself, because it wasn't just your life, it was your cause, your clan perhaps, but what you were fighting for that was the most important thing.
And you'd also have to maintain your arms, I guess, is what a high standard.
Absolutely. For any sword or axe, any good solid blade for use, it has to be carbon steel. And carbon steel, because stainless steel is only a modern. Relatively recent invention, carbon steel rusts. Simply, any type of carbon steel. So you absolutely have to maintain your arms. That was an important part of it.
And just recently, I was listening to there's a feature on Radio 4 at the moment on Walter Scott.
Yes.
And he's talking about this. The series that's been covered at the moment is The Fair Maid of Perth. And in that, you get a lot of the chivalry. So I guess in chivalry, there was a lot of, if you wanted the woman, you would fight for the woman. So you had to have your swordsman's skills sharpened as well.
Well, there are two main theatres of combat, certainly from around 1500 or so, we start to see the institution of single combat become something, quite formalised in a way, but quite relatively commonplace throughout Europe. So where that becomes part of society, then knowledge in arms, skill at arms becomes more necessary across all levels of society. So this is where you start to see fencing schools and academies flourish all throughout Europe from about 1500 onwards. And of course in the Highlands, a fight could start for any good reason And it might be a spilled drink or such, you know. It could be the slightest of reasons in a way, but often it had to be serious enough. And yes, fighting over women, of course, you know, fighting over a slight to your honour or your family was a serious issue enough to fight over. In fact, Rob Roy McGregor fought as a result of an escalation of an exchange with Charles Stewart of Ardshiel, another Jacobite commander. He commanded the Stuarts of Appin at Sheriff Muir and at Culloden. But before Culloden, he'd met with Rob Roy McGregor, and this was to be Rob Roy's last duel. But the reason was an escalation of a little argument that grew over the Battle of Sheriff Muir. And it was Ardshiel's family that were slighted first by McGregor. And of course it predictably rose and escalated enough that blades had to be the recourse. But the following morning, because they were a bit too well in their drams in the evening to fight there and then. But that would be an example of a reason to fight. And there was an old Highland way to do that as well. It wasn't to kill your man, because if you killed a man, then guess what? His family are after you and your family, and things can escalate more and more lives could be lost. So where possible for single combats, you wouldn't go as far as killing. And scratches didn't count either. So first good cut was the way in the Highlands. A good cut you would both recognise as being something good enough to stop the combat. It could be stitched up, and then you'd go to the pub each together,
arm in arm,
and have a drink.
Yeah.
And then you knew it was over.
Got a wee question from one of the viewers here I meant to ask. It's just about your T-shirt. Is that a sword on your T-shirt there, Paul?
That is the sign of the cross and sword, which is the physical sign that hangs right outside just now. That is the logo of MacDonald Armouries. The crosslet is a very traditional form. It's a form you find in medieval heraldry, and it is the cross that you find on all the different branches of the MacDonald clan. So this is core symbolism for Clan Donald, and it has the sword right at the heart of it.
Great questions. So if you have any more questions, remember, just fire them away and we'll see if we can get them answered.
I've got one final question before actually I ask you to walk us through by showing us what you have. And I was thinking maybe to go quite far back to some of the oldest things you've got. And I know you've actually discovered stuff on old battlefields as well, and you've got some of these things you can show us. But one final question, and they might be thinking, we've got quite a big female audience, and I'm thinking about Lady Mackintosh during the Jacobite times, and what might it have been common for women to protect themselves with? We all think about the men, but maybe the women, would they be carrying swords, and how would they maybe protect themselves?
On the whole, women didn't generally carry swords, you know, and we don't find too many references throughout history in the Highlands, certainly, and not many across Scottish history, in fact, of, you know, female swordsmen that way. But carrying a wee blade for your own self-defence, you know, in a tight spot has always been a good thing to do, has always been a smart idea. So the use of small, covert, hidden blades would be the answer there.
Okay, I think we're desperate to now have a look at some of your artefacts and have you talk about them. So maybe if you'd like to show us what you have here.
Yes, well, this is just a wee spread for today of several good examples of basket-hilted swords, basket-hilted broadswords and back swords. And we've got a couple of original pieces here, and both of these have histories behind them and stories behind them. This one here was at the Battle of Preston Pans, and this one here, we've already spoken about Rob Roy McGregor. Well, once upon a time this was his sword.
Could you lift them up?
Physically
Will we look
Yeah,
at that?
yeah.
So this sword here dates from about 1680, 1690, and it's a basket-hilted broadsword, very distinctly of a Highland style, and an earlier Highland basket style. Quite a broad blade, and the channels here, not blood grooves as the popular myth might tell you. These are called fullers, and fullers reduce the weight very evenly down the length of a blade without compromising the physical strength and flexibility of the blade that way.
So this is the original Rob Roy McGregor's?
Yes, that's McGregor's sword.
Wow.
And So the couple of examples I've made myself here. This is a very fine example that I made as a wee challenge to myself. This is a reproduction of a piece from the Argyll collection in Inverary Castle, and the Duke of Argyll asked me to refurbish his collection of arms some years ago.
He has a huge armoury.
Yes,
he's got the whole armoury. Yeah,
he has one of the most opulent and lush castles in Scotland, I think, and very impressive arms collection. And of course, as you would expect from the Campbell chief, it's a mixture of Jacobite and government arms.
No, wait a minute, I'm going to ask you a question here. You're a MacDonald and you made arms for the Campbells?
That's right, yes. Well, Argyll did ask me, actually. He did ask, he did say, I wonder, with you being a MacDonald, are you okay with accepting money from a Campbell? I said, well, as long as you're okay accepting the services of a MacDonald, then we're on good standing.
Okay.
So
You didn't sabotage any of them, did you?
No, not at all. It was a fair trade.
Okay. And we got a few, as somebody says, the Outlander fans send their regards. So,
Good.
yeah.
Aye, good. Well, I had a wee hand in Outlander as well. I did some support artist work, so an extra in the background.
Can you not pinpoint the episode you were in now? Maybe because we've got a lot of real Outlander fans in our audience as well.
Right. I certainly did work on season 2 and season 3, and it was pre-Culloden Jacobite camp scenes. Was the longest of the filming that I did, but there was also a few days that I did in Edinburgh, just Edinburgh town scenes and so on, where you're a townsperson that way.
Couple of another questions. The questions are coming in fast now.
Good.
Was it common for the hand baskets to be lined in any which way, or do people wear gloves with them, or?
Sometimes. This is another one I made. This is a copy of Big Duncan Mackenzie's sword, another one from the Argyll collection, and there's an amazing story that goes with this. I'm not sure if we've got the time for the full story today, but it does have a partial liner. You can see the leather liner, and that's a simple piece of leather just lining the bottom of the basket. So that's as simple as a liner would get, but you would get more tailored liners that would fully fit inside the basket, often made from textiles like velvet or such, just for a little bit of hand protection. It's just to prevent abrasion of the knuckles against the inside of the basket, after some hard use. But to be honest, it's a bit of a luxury to have that inside your basket, because if you're engaging in serious swordsmanship for your life, then, a wee scratch in the knuckles is nothing really. But you did get... you got liners on some, but not all baskets that way.
These are good questions, so, yep.
I think when I visited you way back in your workshop in Edinburgh, I asked you, or the person I was with, about the weighting and the balancing, because looking at some of the weaponry, it looks like how on earth could somebody hold that, or even far less use it in battle. Is there must be some cleverness in the way you are making it and to weight it.
There is, and I'm just looking for the best blade to demonstrate this with. What you find on any good blade, any good sword blade, the real magic behind it in terms of weight and lightness is what you call distal taper. Now, any taper this way is what you call profile taper, and that's the taper of the width, which is often very slight in a lot of sword blades like this. But it's the taper of the thickness of a blade. Now, next time you go to a museum, admire the swords, but also try and see if you can get an angle to see them edge on like this from the back of the blade, and you'll see that it'll be usually about 5 or 6 millimeters thick by the guard, and it will get progressively thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner towards the point, and most blades around the point will be a millimetre or less, usually less than a millimetre thick. So it's getting thinner and thinner, it's getting lighter and lighter towards the point, which means you can have a longer blade and still be light and fast. And it's thinner, which means it slices and cuts better as well. So here's where it's usually going into flesh and bone, and to have a thinner blade, really as thin as your best kitchen knives will be, then that's optimum and that's ideal. But it's still thick enough and strong enough down here where the blade changes shape to go into the grip and fully up and through the pommel. So that's the knack behind any good sword blade. It's called distal taper, and to be honest, when it comes to making a blade, that is the most amount of grinding you do, is to grind that distal taper in before then grinding in triangular or oval or diamond section, whatever shape the blade's going to be, then your fullers, and then your surface finishing through sanding and polishing if necessary, and etching if you're going that far. So there's a lot of different processes involved, but it's that initial distal taper that makes a blade light, and it's your hilt and your pommel at the end that provides the balance by moving the whole weight of the sword back so that it balances. There's no standard, but usually between 3 and 5 or 6 fingers down from the guard, and that means that that blade in the hand is remarkably swift and light and fast.
Fantastic. I was going to ask you, Paul, there was a tradition of people protecting themselves, obviously, and which would be the work of the swordsmith supplying these people, and then what you were saying about battle and coming to an agreement and have it small cuts and whatever to show how accomplished. But when was it that there was more the making of weaponry for display? Because I'm thinking about George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1822, yes, yeah, and all the accoutrements that he had, and then where was there a sort of time when then all the decoration and appearance started to overtake the functionality, or was the functionality of the weapon always going to still be there, or even greater in the more fancy and the appearance of it? Do you think?
Yep, that's a good question, actually. As far as function goes, then function's always followed through and been there for any swords that have been crafted. You don't find swords being crafted just to be wall hangers, just to be display pieces, really, until the 19th century, where there was a Gothic revival, of course, and there was a requirement then for, rich castle owners then to deck out their castle in those Gothic styles, including great displays of weapons. And where originals couldn't be found, then good smiths and makers were found that could reproduce the more historic medieval and 16th and 17th century weapons. So unfortunately today we do find some of these weapons coming through current market, and you have to have an eye for 19th century reproductions because some of them are very good. And often though, the giveaway is when you pick it up, because when you pick it up, if it feels like a pig and it feels too heavy, it's probably not got a distal taper, it's probably not been made fully for function that way. So that's one of the first giveaways. But also in the late 18th century is where we start to see regimental traditions appear in Highland weapons. The Highland regiments themselves were established early on in the 1740s, and with the development of these into the British Army and the adoption of them, then of course there are certain hallmarks of the British Army that take over in terms of the weaponry, and that is basically blinging everything up. So making the hilts, appear brighter and shinier by either polished or silver plate or nickel plate, and having your dirk and your ski and doos fully on show, and again plated and shiny and with big cairngorm stones on top, so it really accentuated everything. And that's something you only start to see from the late 18th century, early 19th century on, is that style of weapon. They're still made for use and they're still functional, but they're going to look a bit different from the original weapons that came before them.
Just got a question of hygiene here. It's from Rob saying, don't you have to be careful when you're handling the swords in case you get perspiration on them to make them rust?
Yes, very good point, and I'm glad you picked that up. That's me being told off.
You should be wearing gloves.
Yes, I maintain these arms constantly. So anytime they're brought out for talks like this and so on, it'll be fully, wiped down and cleaned afterwards.
I told you we've got a knowledgeable audience here.
Yes, and you did ask about maintenance of arms, and that's part of it today as well. Yes,
okay.
You're quite right, because if you handle blades, steel blades with your fingers directly, and then you leave it and don't touch it. And I've seen full-on thumbprints and fingerprints in museum pieces that have been sadly left that way and not treated after handling. So yeah, absolutely, yes, spot on.
Another question Paul was going to ask you was, talked about the Scottish regiments, and after Culloden, of course, and fighting the American wars and the Napoleonic wars, but how much was traditional Scottish swords, knives and so on integrated? Well, I mean, in our modern times, were they still being used, say, in the First World War? You know, I'm thinking about small knives and things that might have been because they wore full Highland dress when they were fighting the Scottish regiments. So how late did it survive in terms of battle? And of course today, I mean, currently, is that still the case?
Yeah, there was an account in the Crimea War. I believe it was a sergeant defending his officer who'd fallen, and he did so with a sword. So there are accounts of swords still being used. A lot of people might know famously of Jack Churchill, who was quite famous in the Second World War for being a great martial traditionalist. Now, he was a piper as well, and often woke his men up first thing in the morning by playing the pipes. And he also often carried a basket hilt sword at his side. And once, when there was a superior that called him up on this and said that, you know, he shouldn't have been carrying it because it was only for parade, his response was, "Sir, I believe that any officer without a sword is improperly dressed." That was his take on it. He carried his commando knife, and he even carried a bow and arrows into war on occasions as well, and was credited with the last kill in the British Army by bow and arrow in the Second World War. So he certainly went forward with his basket hilt sword on a few occasions as well.
You wouldn't want to cross him, would you?
You wouldn't know. But I have also heard from some customers of their family swords, where they've had a 17th or 18th century, Jacobite period blade in a First World War or a Second World War hilt. And that's been part of the army regulations, was that you could carry a family blade as long as the hilt was of the correct type for when you were serving. So in fact, there's even been Jacobite blades have gone forward in the front lines in the Second World War that way too.
Oh, thank you. It's good to know that, because we can't lose track of what current Scottish regiments are doing as well. It's all part of what the transition. Is there anything else, in terms of other articles? And I know you've made some finds on battlefields or close to battlefields that perhaps the audience would be interested to have a look at.
Sure. So there's a few things here I've brought up. The Jacobite period's been quite a focus for our wee battlefield archaeology group, which goes by the name of Conflicts of Interest, and we do go looking for battlefields that haven't been previously explored, and one we've been working on quite a bit that's going to be years long in the project is the site of the Siege of Fort William. Now, this was a couple of weeks before Culloden. This was late March, early April. It lasted for a whole 2 weeks, and it's where the Jacobites took their artillery and put them first on Sugarloaf Hill, just at the foot of Cow Hill in Fort William, and they basically started to bombard with their artillery the fort at Fort William. It was their aim to take the fort, which for the Jacobites would have been, a major asset to have, for them to regroup, for them to rearm, and that could have extended the campaign quite considerably. They also, before this, tried to take Stirling Castle, but very unsuccessfully. They got smashed in a day. The artillery that survived came up to Fort William, and of course they were getting the artillery back full on from the fort in the form of 6-pound cannon, 12-pound cannon, swivel guns from 2 naval support ships in Loch Linnhe, as well as 13-inch and 6-inch mortars. And this is a fragment of a 13-inch mortar, which would essentially have been an iron sphere packed with powder. And this is about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches thick iron. So this is a hefty piece of iron in itself. Certainly enough to ruin your evening.
And your party.
That's huge. I know, it's amazing. I see you've got, is that musket balls you've got there, or is it fragments of something else? Or?
Yes, these are musket balls. Musket balls, of course, are lead projectiles that were used for muskets or pistols of the period.
Could I actually just to tilt the box a wee bit there?
Yeah. And these specifically are from a location known as High Bridge. And High Bridge, famously, was the location of the first shots fired in the 45 Rising. So these were some of the first shots fired by MacDonald's of Keppoch, who managed to head off and engage with government troops that were sent as reinforcements for Fort William at the time. And so they successfully managed to face about 80 soldiers with only a dozen men. A dozen men and a piper. And that's enough to start a rising. Mm-hmm. So these were the first shots fired on the 16th of August, 1745.
Excellent. And you go to battlefields across the country then, looking for artefacts, and do you use the metal detectors? And
yes, that's right. Our group is metal detecting based, so yeah, we base all our search efforts on that. Although we're hoping to step up in terms of the kit we can access and use to make things a bit more interesting. This is probably the most ancient find.
I know, we just got asked a question. I kept this back because
Yes.
just got asked about Pictish stuff.
Ah, good. Well, funnily enough,
On cue.
this is a Pictish axe that I pulled from a bog in Glen Clover in, I think it was 2017. This came up. So
What's that made of?
this is, well, it's iron, for the most part, iron cheeks, but on close inspection you can make out that it's got a pattern welded, or Damascus steel if you like, or pattern welded core running through the axe, and iron wrap around that to give it the heft and give it the form. So it's actually, technologically, is quite a piece of engineering, and you'd need to be a pretty skilled bladesmith today to make this.
And where did you say you got this? You found this?
This came from Glen Clover.
Glen Clover.
Just above Kirriemuir, up in Angus, which is an area of ancient settlement. It's one of these glorious glens, flat-bottomed glen with a river running through it and hills either side, so you'd have beasts all around, arable lands, water, everything you need for your own wee slice of heaven. And you just know these places have been settled, not just for centuries, but thousands of years.
And do you do any reproduction of Pictish material? Any of your stuff that you do when you make commission wise? Do you?
I do actually, not so much commission wise, but just out of sheer personal interest. I've looked at the Pictish carvings with some degree of interest, because we know the stone carvers, 1,000 years plus ago, were still artists. And they were artists with great eye for detail and proportion. So you find that the figures are well proportioned, you find that the detail in the clothing is right as well, so there's no reason to doubt that a weapon might be too small or too large for what it was. You have to put that faith in the artists of that day to know what you're looking at is right. And so from that I've looked to try and sort of what's the word? Classify the weapons of the Picts, and it is possible to determine certain patterns of weapons, such as the axes. There's two distinctive axe styles that you see in the carvings, and I've reproduced one of those. I'm not sure, I think that's upstairs, I don't have it down here, but I've made Pictish style spears, and my real passion is looking at the shields. And some of these are quite unique, and that you don't find the shield styles anywhere else in Europe. And so it's become a little passion of mine to remake these. And yep, I've got a little Pictish shield here.
And funnily enough, I was up at Sweno's Stone just last week in Forres.
So this is one of two little Pictish bucklers that I remade. And very distinctive little H-shaped buckler. And it's these notches on the top that actually are for your spear to sit in. So you can use a fully extended defence like this with your spear at the same time. And this allows you to use offence and defence at the same time, which in terms of European martial arts has only been imagined to be a concept, explored in the early medieval period. But this idea predates it by at least 500 years, which is quite exciting.
Yeah, but I would never have thought a shield would be that shape. You know, you have this foregone conclusion that a shield is going to be either like the sickle or it's going to be like the, as we say, shield and heraldry with the kind of, I'm sure they know what I'm talking about, yeah.
And this is just one little detail that does repeat across several carvings, and the proportions there too, so we can have faith in that this shape at least, you know, and approximate weight for what it is going to be right. And the fact that it's unique to Pictish culture is quite exciting. So it's bringing these to life from the stone.
Yeah, we covered a little hidden corner up in Aberlemno of the Pictish stone there, and what was struck by was the Northumbrians, because it was the battle of Dynich, and it was a famous battle anyway, and you could identify the opposition by the nose guards on the helmets. So just when you were saying how authentic and how well crafted and represented, it makes us reposition the Picts, who are often thought of as being barbarous people. They were quite sophisticated, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, look at the finest examples of Pictish silver brooches, and they're outstanding. They're crammed with finest knotwork you can imagine. And to make one of those today, you have to be a professional silversmith at the top of your game. You know, we strive to reproduce the best art that they had back then, which absolutely proves they had the highest artists. And where you have that in one element of material culture, then that translates, of course, across to all elements. So their textiles, their music, their song, their language, and so on would have been up there as well. Of course, not everyone would have been high artists, but you know that that high level of art existed across the board, and in the martial arts as well.
And they regarded their artists highly as well. So there were these people who would be the artists would be, you know, although they might not be involved in the front line of stuff, they were still highly regarded within their societies because they were doing creative work and for kings and queens of their
yeah, absolutely. Well. You know, the manufacture of arms, especially in an early warrior culture, was of high importance. And also when we moved from the Bronze to the Iron Age, became a bit more interesting on a deeper level as well, because arms makers in the Iron Age were regarded as almost as alchemists, because they were able to manipulate all the elements, earth, air, fire and water, and produce something of a higher quality that had the ability to take or give life.
I must ask you, what does Master at Arms mean?
Maestro is my professional title, which is a Master at Arms essentially is a historical fencing master. So it's one who can teach various weapon forms and martial art forms across the board.
Excellent.
Have you got any advisory role when we have these movies that are made in terms of swordsmanship and stuff like that? Do you have input into stuff like that?
I've occasionally made arms for movies, TV production work, not very often though, but in terms of the actual martial content and swordsmanship, that's a different art, and that's fight direction. That is something that I do. I'm a qualified fight director as well, though I've only really worked more locally. The very occasional TV piece, but it's work that's exciting as well, and it's really interesting work. It's choreographing sequences and fight scenes, which is amazingly engaging, especially if you're looking to do that and reproduce a realistic historic fight. Because you have to understand the weapon forms, the way they move, the way the bodies move with that as well. And then you're bringing in the intention of the characters, you know, why are they fighting, which one's being more aggressive or passive in the actions, and how do you interpret all that through a fight. It's fascinating work, and I love doing it, and I've never felt as though I've had enough fight direction work. So if there are any movie directors or producers out there looking for fight direction from Scotland, well, that's a shameless plug right there.
Lord of the Rings is coming to Scotland. It's going to be filming Lord of the Rings here.
Well,
so get your resume up to the studios.
Maybe I should.
Make a plug, yeah.
Yeah, I think Scottish historical drama is getting more and more popular, and I think series like Outlander have made that happen. So there's so many stories in Scottish history that have yet to be told, and I'm sure your knowledge and accomplishments would be highly in demand. So,
has the popular resurgence of the HEMA had an impact on you?
Right. Well, I suppose I was partly responsible for that in the early days. HEMA is Historical European Martial Arts. It's an all-encompassing term. And in my early days, when all I could find was sport fencing, I got torn into that and loved it. Realised what wasn't there, but spent a while looking for anyone teaching historical fencing, historical European martial arts. And in 1993-94, there was nothing. I couldn't find a thing. It was the early days of the internet as well, and I remember going to internet cafes, which were a great novelty in Edinburgh at the time, and still finding nothing. Not even on Yahoo groups at the time. And so that's where I was faced with starting something, and I knew that was a very serious decision to make as well, because I absolutely felt and knew this was not just going to be a hobby. This was a passion that was going to lead to something more. And I actually spent a couple of weeks dropping it altogether, not fencing, just to make the decision. And I did. It was a wee day. I dedicated my life to the path of the sword that way. So yes, I can say that I started, I think, the first historical fencing group in the UK. And 4 years after that, we'd managed to inspire other folk to start small groups. We established the British Federation for Historical Swordplay, which was getting as many small groups, and there was maybe 5 or 6 at the time, at the very start, together under an umbrella body. And from there it just kind of grew and expanded simultaneously across Western Europe and the US and Canada. And it was fascinating to watch and see. And I got involved in some of the very first international gatherings in the States and Canada as well, which was great. And I'm still travel out there. And that's been fascinating to watch unfold. And there's no doubt that what you're all watching this on now in the internet has been largely responsible for that rapid communication and acceleration of growth at the same time.
Excellent. I told you we're going to get some good questions here.
I've got a question that you probably don't want me to ask, Paul. Right, here it is. What about the sword at the Wallace Monument in Stirling? I mean, do you want to say something about that? But if you don't, you're fully excused. But if you got some input about that sword, I'd be quite interested to hear it.
It has come up here, but people.
All right, that's okay. That's okay. So. The truth comes out. I made that sword in 1990. No, that's not true. Not true at all. Not true. Can edit that out, right? No. The Wallace sword is an interesting one, because when you look at it and you look at the history it's connected to, it is a bit tenuous. The connection to one Wallace sword to be re-hilted from King James's court comes from 1504, I think it is. Now, for that hilt form and hilt and pommel form, when you look at the hilt and pommel form, they're not quite 1504 style, you could say. They're definitely a few decades later, you could say. So the hilt and pommel don't match the historic reference it's supposed to be connected to. Also, the reference just doesn't mention William Wallace specifically. It mentions one Wallace sword. So there's enough tenuousness there that, we can't put faith in that exactly. When you look at the sword closer as well, you'll notice that the blade is actually comprised of a few different elements. It's not just one blade. So there's several different bits going on there. The pointy end, if you like, the lower portion of that blade, could well be the oldest part of the whole sword. So it's possible that that part of the blade perhaps was once a part of a sword that belonged to William Wallace. That's about as much as you can say. But the more important thing really on the larger scale is that sword is a big two-handed sword, and it's called the Wallace sword, and it inspires people today still with the history and the story of William Wallace. So I think that's the more important thing that it still does for us today.
Just a quick one after that, Paul. I know the Robert the Bruce's sword I've seen it, and I know the family. I know the Blues family, and so I'm not going to tread on their toes too much. But I'd just like to get your input on that one. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a sword I know quite intimately as well. I've studied it very closely, hands-on, several times, and remade it as well. And two-handed swords, there's been a lot of debate about when two-handed swords came about in Europe and in Scotland and so on. And there are enough references to confirm, and contemporary illustrations as well, to confirm that we do have two-handed swords from the mid to the late 13th century. So absolutely, Wallace and Bruce period, there were two-handed swords. There were certainly what you call hand-and-a-half swords, where the pommel, if the point's on the floor, the pommel's coming up to about sternum height. So that would be what you call hand-and-a-half. You can still use it with one hand. It's still light enough to move with one hand on horseback or foot, but big enough grip and enough weight to swing and move with two hands as well. The full, larger two-handed swords, getting up to head height, I think there is just enough reference to backdate them to the late 13th century that way as well. And this is the difficult thing. The further back you go in history, of course, the less written records you have. So you actually have to then look closer at the illustrations, because when it comes to the Pictish world, that's all we've got. We've got the illustrations carved in stone to go on. We've not got the written records, so that's the best basis. And it's the same in Europe for early medieval references as well. So the illustrations are invaluable, and they're worth delving into. And you do find these two-handed swords, late 13th century. In fact, there's one that I'm going to be working on this year, and that is the only sword that, in fact, you can directly attribute to the Scottish Wars of Independence, any of them. And that's the Stirling Bridge sword. And it's a sword that was found in the banks of the Forth at the original site of the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And it was discovered, I think it was 1870s. And I studied this sword very closely when it was at an auction house in Edinburgh last year. And my first job was to verify its authenticity, or the period of it, to know if that was right. And it is. It's a hand-and-a-half sword, and it's spot on. It's German in make. I mentioned about German imported arms. It's one of those. So it's impossible to tell which side used it, whether it was English or Scottish that used it. But it's beautiful. It's absolutely all there, except for the grips, of course, gone. The organic material's gone. But the sword is beautiful. It floats in the hand, and it's a good quality longsword from the late 13th century. So they were around back then.
Yeah, finally, I'm going to pass on to Joe very briefly. We'll be not long to go on our podcast. But just one thing I was wanting to ask: do you have a broadsword here that you could show us at all?
Yes, I probably do.
So
I've got another question about a hand-and-a-half sword.
There's an aluminium bladed one. That's a prop sword that was used by Kevin Costner.
Well,
when he
they
was
won't hear you
rehearsing.
actually because I'm away with the microphone. So.
I'm just finding my long sword here.
I think we'd be interested to hear the Kevin Costner connection, because I think they lost you at that point.
Sorry,
What was that?
I was just pointing to this one down here, and this is an aluminium bladed movie prop sword that was used by Kevin Costner when he was doing his fight scene rehearsals for Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. But that's an aside.
It's always interesting.
Oh yeah, aye. In fact,
If you want. I don't know.
Come
if
across
you want
here.
to come over here.
Yeah.
So this here is a hand-and-a-half sword, what you call a long sword, and still, like any other good sword blade, has to be light and has to be fast enough, but still carry enough weight to do the job. So these weren't designed for light cuts or scratches at all. These are for lopping bits off men and ending lives in a good solid blow. So it has to have enough weight but move quickly with it, and that's where the weight and balance comes in. So that's what a medieval longsword looks like there.
And somebody mentioned a bastard sword.
That's a bastard sword as well.
Okay.
But the term bastard sword came about because it was between a single-handed sword and a full, larger two-handed sword. It was somewhere in the middle. That's where that term comes from.
Questions are coming
So
in.
these are known as long swords,
Yeah.
hand-and-a-half swords, bastard swords, all the same.
I've got another question. A skein do And I think your interpretation of a ski and do is probably different to the Victorian small knife that a lot of guys carry in their sock when they're wearing the kilt. So could you just explain what the ski and do was like and what it was used for?
Well, the ski and do, and skiing and Gaelic knife and do is a lot of people say black, but it's more accurately dark. Dark is a more accurate exchange for do. Like it's often used, it's still used in the Highlands for names. If you're calling someone, you know, like often there's a dozen Donalds in any one village, you know, so you differentiate them by saying fair-haired Donald, Donald Buey, or Donald Do if he's got black hair, you know, or Donald Do if he's just a bit dodgy, you know. So it's dark, you know, and the knife had that name as well. It was a ski and do. It was the dark knife because originally it was a covert blade. It was something you would have on you somewhere. There was no standard place for it. And it could get you out of a tight spot. And Rob Roy McGregor got out of a tight spot because he had a ski and do on him in an incident and managed to free himself and make his escape. But originally they looked different to, you know, the black gripped, you know, shiny mounts with stones, Victorian style that you see today. That's what's followed through. Originally they were very simple and were either simple turned and carved with knotwork wooden grips, sometimes made of antler and sometimes horn, but very simple. There was no standards in those days, and the blades were very simple as well, often simple single-edged blades.
But they weren't as sharp as the one that we put in our sock. Is that the case? The ski and do, it would have been more like a dagger. It would have been longer. Would that have been the case?
There were different types of knives, and this is something I've recently put together a full presentation on the history and development of Scottish knives and daggers, because there's been very simple ideas about them, I think, previously. And one of the simple ideas about the ski and do was that it came from a simple hidden dagger and that was it. But there's a difference between the different origins of the ski and do's, and there it used to be something called a drover's knife, which then became something called a gralach knife, and that merged together with the Highland dagger to become the ski and do. So there's actually 3 different blade types back there that led to the evolution of the ski and do. You know, the more you look into history, the more muddied the waters get in a way, and the more questions are raised. And the dirk has its own history as well, the long knife. You know, we've had our small knives and we've had our short knives in Highland culture. And the dirk has an ancient history, actually. It's been supposed that it came from a knife called the Balak knife, which was a medieval dagger from the 14th to 15th century. But in fact, I found the smoking gun of the evidence that confirms we have Pictish daggers, dirks in fact. We have dirks going back to the Iron Age, and that form carrying on through history to become the 17th century dirk and evolving a little more over time as well.
That's amazing. Well, I think I've really picked Paul's brains on all the things to do with saws and daggers and everything else.
Where does your business come from nowadays? How do you turn your absolute passion that comes across, and you've turned a hobby with your passion into a business, a very successful business? You told me before we went on air that you had a 2.5-year waiting list?
Oh, no, much more than that.
So question
I wouldn't be doing very well if it was only 2.5 years, no.
So question 1 is, who are your, where does your business come from, for a start? And I mean, geographically as well as where it comes from. And how long is your waiting list if you were someone who wanted to get a sword commissioned?
Well, I'll have to start off by disappointing folks and saying, unfortunately, I've stopped taking orders. And that's at least for the meantime. And I stopped taking orders early last year because for my commando knives, the World War II style commando knives, that's a main line, what I call my bread and butter knife. I was 5 years quoting lead times for those and quoting 5 to 10 years for custom swords and knives. And folk were still saying, oh, that's okay, I don't mind waiting. And you do start to think, when does that end? You know. So I've had to cap the orders for now. I may take them up again in future. If I can mention the MacDonald Armoury's Facebook page, then that's where anything I do have for sale at any time would go up. And if I'm starting taking orders, then that's where that scary notice for me would go up. But that's the situation at the moment, yes. I mean,
We will post your details up
yes,
as well.
yeah. You can probably see the order boards on that wall over there, but that's how extensive they look right now.
Okay.
And that's every one of those little lines is an order, and some of those are multiple orders as well.
I won't give any names though, I won't go too close.
It's to do with artisan crafts too, because I commissioned bagpipes, and I had a set of border pipes, and I had to wait several years.
Yes.
But it's worth the waiting. But it's all the craftsmanship and love that goes into making it.
I think the same with any craft that way.
Yeah.
It's not unusual, in fact, amongst knife makers, that good quality knife makers with a good reputation to have a 5-year lead time. It's quite usual. And it helps with knives and swords, I suppose. Everybody likes shiny things. They sell quite well because they're shiny. But I've always had the idea from starting the business onwards that quality always sells. And I've maintained that rigorously. I've hung my faith on that solid coat hook. I think that anything you make, it doesn't matter what you start up in business doing, as long as it's quality that you're offering, then you're always going to find a market for that. That doesn't mean it gives you a right to charge what you like for it. You still have to be realistic. And in fact, usually in craftsmanship, you undercharge and undersell yourself quite easily. That's almost anyone I know that makes anything. They've always done that. But yes, that's always been a mantra from the start. Stick to quality and keep doing that. Keep refining as you go.
Another good question here is: do you work alone, or do you have an apprentice, or?
I have in the past. I've had apprentices. I've had employees, but only on very short-term bases. The last time I thought I'd look for an apprentice, I put a little press release in the Edinburgh Evening News and Scotsman only. I thought I'll just put it in those, get a little bit of local attention, because I was in Edinburgh at the time, and I thought that's all I'll need. Well, it was printed, and then the next day, pretty much every national newspaper picked up on it as a quirky, interesting story. Swordmaker seeks apprentice, and online it just went viral. And I had over 1,200 emails from 30 different countries, and I had a year-long selection process. So I had one fellow, a great lad, Eric, from Canada, who came on board and said, right, you've got a 2-year visa, let's get you up to speed and quality to make X number of knife blades in a day. And that was the plan. Unfortunately, he didn't make that mark at the end of his time, and he had to go back to Canada. I decided from then just to crack on with my own hands. So I do everything myself. I do all the crafting, admin. Admin takes up usually hours a day, but, and all sides of it that way. And I'm quite comfortable doing that just now.
Mm-hmm. And we've got somebody here trying to find out where your forge is, but we did say it's an undisclosed.
Yes, and that's a good point as well. Everyone, a lot of folk come down, and they'll expect to see a blazing hot, fiery forge and standing with a bare chest, hammering steel, and that's not the look at all. I use the convenience of power tools and electricity to grind and sand my blades using a process called stock removal. And that's the way that most makers work today. So I don't have a forge at all. Mm-hmm. It'd be lovely to have one. It's a very, traditional thing.
Especially in winter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it would help heat this place, all right. But yes, I use a process called stock removal. That's the way that most makers are making blades today.
Excellent.
I've got just one question that's popped up in my head. How does it come to you, the material for making swords? It may seem it's quite an obvious question, but sometimes people, these are the things that people wonder about. How does it come to you initially? Yeah.
Let me find something. Find a piece of stock.
But don't feel that we're trying to get your secret recipe, like Coca-Cola or something.
There's a long bar of flat steel running along the bottom of the benches there, and that's 2-inch by 3/16" thick. Spring steel or carbon steel, and that's a raw stock form for my blade. So this right here is several bars, in fact, of stock steel. But if I'm making many of one thing, like the commando knives, I make a lot of those, then they start life laser cut in carbon steel. So this is a carbon steel blank for a commando knife blade. And the first thing I do from there is hand grind the distal taper. Remember that taper of the thickness going thinner towards the point. And then I'll grind on the section of the blade. And here's one that's halfway done, I think. Got a light clip to it. There we go. So here's one that's been ground. And you can see it's got a diamond section. It's got 4 faces there, but that's been ground by hand. It's been ground as a distal taper, and then the section of the blade. So this has still got to be fully sanded down. This is what you call the tang. The tang has still to be ground down, and a threaded section gets added on there, and this will then be fully sanded and polished, in fact, and then acid etched. So it's still got a wee bit of work to go, but that's how my knife blades would start off. Convenience of laser cutting, which gives you a very accurate blade form every time as well.
Got one last question for you, Paul, because we're getting near the hour here. Somebody's asked about the carving on the wall just behind you.
Oh, right, aye.
This audience misses nothing.
So I see, yeah. We've got us in full screen, clearly. So this is a shield. It's a wooden shield that I made here. And it's an interesting one. It's one that it's what I call my vision shield. I saw this in a vision once, born by an armed warrior wearing chainmail and a nasal style conical helmet. And I don't know quite where it came from. I don't know quite who he was, but it was very, very clear. And I zoomed in, if you like, in my mind to see the detail on that shield, because I'd never quite seen the likes of it before. And
would you call it Pictish? Do you think
sketched it down at the time and had to make it.
You made it. Everything you see. I tell you what, this has been the comments we're getting here, Paul, are amazing, because I don't think people thought it'd be so interesting, but they're actually coming back here, giving us big thumbs up, big love hearts and the whole thing. We've even had comments about your arms. A very discerning audience.
Speaking personally, I couldn't wait to come here.
Yeah,
I think this is
Scottish arms. They're white, verging on blue.
No, just saying. Personally, I couldn't wait to come here and speak to Paul, because what he does is fascinating. It's very intriguing, and of course from the historical perspective. And I've really loved, interviewing you here. It's been great, very special. Thanks very much.
Want a part 2.
Aye.
I might do a part 2. Very special. So this is Paul MacDonald Armories, Master at Arms, and in a beautiful setting, undisclosed, in the Scottish borders. We've just had a ball today. So thanks very much, Paul.
You're very, very welcome. Anytime.
What a great addition to our craftsmen, craftswomen, the features that we're doing. We're finding hidden gems throughout Scotland, and you're a big hit.